A 58-year-old woman welcomed her 26-year-old Facebook lover into her Chattanooga home, and just 2 months later, she and her daughter vanished without a trace. No break-in. No witness. No goodbye. The only thing left behind was a quiet house, and a neighbor who swore he saw something no one believed. But what investigators would uncover next had nothing to do with a robbery, and everything to do with a decades-old grudge, a backyard no one dared dig up, and a mother-in-law who never let go of a deadly assumption. The bodies weren't where they were supposed to be. The killer wasn't who he claimed to be. And the truth about the husband's death? That was the one secret that should have died with him. But it didn't. And what it exposed would turn the entire case upside down. On the evening of November 16, 2014, a missing persons report was filed at the Chattanooga Police Department by Tyrone Banks, a local HVAC technician and father of one. His wife, Celeste Ward Banks, had left home the previous evening to spend the night at her mother's house, as she occasionally did. But when she failed to return home or answer repeated calls, and her mother, Delphine Ward, was also unreachable, Tyrone contacted authorities. What began as a welfare check would quickly evolve into a layered case that baffled both investigators and the community. Officers were dispatched to Delphine's single-story residence in a quiet suburban neighborhood off Tunnel Boulevard. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, and nothing to indicate the women had packed to leave. Celeste's overnight bag was still in the guest room. Delphine's phone, keys, and purse were in their usual place by the kitchen counter. Her car was in the garage. There were no recent withdrawals from her bank account and no activity on either woman's phones after 10:34 p.m. the previous night. Both devices had since gone dark. When questioned, neighbors said they hadn't noticed anything unusual, except for one man. Several residents mentioned that Delphine had recently allowed a younger man to move in. He had been seen coming and going at odd hours, sometimes driving Delphine's car, sometimes leaving in a different vehicle altogether. No one knew his name. One neighbor described him as polite but very quiet, while another recalled he looked too young to be her relative. Some assumed he was a relative or caregiver, while others believed he was a tenant. No one had ever been introduced to him directly. Police asked Tyrone about the man, but he said Celeste had only briefly mentioned someone helping Delphine around the house. According to Tyrone, Celeste was concerned but not alarmed. She told him her mother had met someone online and was giving him a chance. She hadn't shared much more than that. Officers searched the residence more thoroughly. Nothing appeared ransacked or tampered with. The television was off. Dishes in the sink were clean. The only thing that stood out was a faint smell of bleach near the back hallway, but with no physical signs of blood or struggle, there was no immediate basis for foul play. Cadaver dogs brought in later that day hit on nothing inside the house or in the surrounding yard. With no leads, investigators turned back to the man Delphine had allowed into her home. He wasn't listed on any lease records, wasn't on file with the utility companies, and hadn't been captured on any available surveillance in the area. Neighbors had no photos. The case had no name to begin tracing, only a vague timeline and the memory of someone who didn't quite fit. By the end of the second day, investigators reached one defining conclusion. Delphine Ward's last known contact was an unidentified man she had met online. Delphine Ward had been a widow for nearly 8 years when she met the man who would later be identified as Marlon Cross. She'd spent most of that time focused on her health, her granddaughter, and occasional volunteer work. Friends described her as private but warm, someone who had endured loss with quiet strength. She rarely dated and had never shown much interest in starting over. That changed in the spring of 2014, when she began messaging a man on Facebook. The account that reached out to her belonged to someone calling himself J. Cross. His profile was sparse but clean, no obvious red flags. His messages were respectful, polite, and unusually vulnerable. He said he had come across her profile through a friend's comment and felt compelled to reach out. He claimed to be trying to turn his life around after a rough few years, including a period of homelessness. He said he had no close family and had once made mistakes, but he was now looking to rebuild, and was drawn to how grounded Delphine seemed. At first, their exchanges were casual. Delphine didn't tell many people. A few close friends later said they remembered her mentioning a man she was chatting with online, but no one thought it was serious. Over time, however, the messages turned more personal. Cross presented himself as someone misunderstood by the world but deeply appreciative of kindness. He complimented Delphine's maturity, her strength, and her warmth. He never asked for money. Instead, he gradually created the image of a man with a hard past but a better future, if someone just gave him a chance. By late summer, Delphine told a friend from her veteran support group that she was considering meeting the man in person. When asked if she was sure it was safe, she reportedly said, "He's not asking for anything. He's just lonely. So am I." The first meeting happened in a public cafe, according to what Delphine shared with her daughter Celeste. He was charming, younger than expected, mid to late 20s, and well-spoken. He claimed to be staying in a friend's garage but wanted to get back on his feet and eventually return to school. Delphine told Celeste he had made mistakes in his 20s but seemed genuinely remorseful and focused now. By September, Marlon, still known to her as Jay, was staying over regularly. Celeste reportedly expressed concern, but Delphine assured her that it was her choice and that he was helpful around the house. She believed she was helping someone who deserved a second chance. Within weeks, he moved in permanently. What Delphine didn't appear to notice, or at least never mentioned, were the subtle changes that followed. Friends who visited less frequently said he was often the one who answered the door. He began running errands in her car. He took phone calls in private and rarely offered personal details. One friend said that when she visited, Delphine looked like she was trying too hard to act normal. Another noticed that when she offered to help Delphine install a security camera system she'd recently purchased, the package had been quietly put away, never opened. By mid-October, Marlon Cross was no longer a guest in Delphine Ward's house. He was its quiet gatekeeper, and she didn't seem to realize it. Before we dive deeper, let's take a look at the perfect family before her husband died. Delphine Ward had spent nearly a decade navigating life as both a veteran and a widow. She enlisted in the Army during her early 20s and served for several years before returning home to Tennessee, where she met Maurice Ward, a fellow veteran with a quiet demeanor and a reputation for being dependable. They married and had their only child, Celeste, 3 years later. The two shared a modest but structured life in Chattanooga. Delphine worked as a VA claims assistant while Maurice transitioned into private security work after his discharge. Friends and former co-workers described their marriage as stable, though not particularly public. They rarely socialized beyond church circles or veteran functions. Celeste was raised in a disciplined home, and the family remained relatively low profile until 2006, when Maurice was shot dead in what was initially believed to be a carjacking. The shooting took place in a downtown parking lot after he left a late shift at a part-time gig. Witnesses reported hearing a single gunshot but saw no suspect. Morris's wallet was found at the scene, and his vehicle had not been taken. Investigators opened a homicide file, but after multiple interviews and surveillance checks, the case stalled. With no physical evidence and no apparent motive, Morris's murder was eventually deemed unsolved, though not closed. While Delphine grieved quietly and focused on raising Celeste, one person never accepted the police's conclusion: Morris's mother, Loretta Ward. A longtime resident of Hamilton County, Loretta ran a small storefront church in East Chattanooga and was known to her community as blunt, controlling, and fiercely loyal to her son. From the day of the funeral, Loretta made it known she didn't believe her daughter-in-law's account of the night Maurice died. She claimed Delphine had been too calm, too rehearsed, and too ready with answers. According to those close to the family, Loretta accused Delphine, publicly and often, of orchestrating Maurice's death to collect his life insurance. The accusations never led to legal action. Police found no signs of Delphine's involvement. She had been at work at the time of the shooting, and no financial irregularities were tied to her. Still, Loretta's suspicions didn't fade. Over time, she cut contact with her daughter-in-law almost entirely and maintained a tense, often distant relationship with Celeste, whom she continued to visit on rare occasions. Not long after that, Loretta reached out to someone from her past, an ex-member of her church who had once been incarcerated for drug-related offenses. Through this contact, she was introduced to a man she believed could help her settle the score, a younger ex-con named Marlon Cross. What Loretta didn't know was that Marlon had a deeper record than the one shared with her. His criminal past included theft, aggravated assault, and identity fraud, though some charges had been sealed due to clerical errors and lack of testimony. By the time Loretta met with him, he was presenting himself as someone starting over, but willing to handle business for the right price. The meeting between Loretta and Marlon took place privately, away from church property. There was no digital record of communication and no traceable paper trail. According to later confessions, Loretta explained her suspicions, offered partial payment up front, and instructed Marlon to get close to Delphine, build trust, and make sure she never hurts anyone else again. Marlon agreed. He used a stolen identity to create a new Facebook account, constructed a basic profile, and began messaging Delphine. The plan was in motion, driven by a woman with no evidence, only hatred, and a man with nothing to lose. On the night of November 15, 2014, Delphine Ward was home with her daughter Celeste, who had come over earlier that afternoon. According to later statements from Celeste's husband, she had planned to spend the night after sensing that her mother had been feeling uneasy for several days. There were no outward signs of tension when they last spoke around 9 p.m. Celeste said she'd call in the morning. Sometime after 11 p.m., Delphine was alone in the living room, reportedly watching television. Celeste had already gone to the guest room for the night. Marlon Cross had left the house earlier and returned just before midnight. There were no surveillance cameras on the property, and none of the neighbors recalled hearing anything out of the ordinary. Marlon entered through the back door. He had spent the previous 2 months integrating himself into Delphine's daily routines, cooking, cleaning, and occasionally doing grocery runs. That night, however, his behavior shifted. According to his later confession, he waited for signs that the house was quiet. He assumed Celeste had already left or was no longer there. Armed with nothing but a towel taken from the hallway closet, he approached Delphine from behind while she was seated. She struggled. There were no defensive wounds, and number 911 call was made. Marlon strangled Delphine with the towel until she stopped moving. Within moments, Celeste came downstairs. She had likely heard the noise or sensed movement. Investigators believe she entered the room before realizing what was happening. She attempted to intervene or flee, but Marlon turned on her immediately. She, too, was strangled, this time using only his hands. The scene was swift, violent, and without clear premeditation for the second victim. Marlon later admitted that Celeste's death had not been part of the original plan. He had only been instructed to deal with Delphine. But once Celeste witnessed the aftermath, he believed he had no choice. The possibility of being identified, arrested, or exposed was too great. After both women were dead, Marlon began cleaning. He used bleach to wipe surfaces, packed their phones, and gathered both bodies. Delphine was wrapped in an old bedsheet. Celeste was placed in a blanket from the guest room. There was no blood, no broken glass, and no sign of forced entry, just a faint chemical odor and missing persons. By 3 a.m., Marlin had loaded both bodies into the back of Delphine's SUV. He left the lights off as he backed out of the garage and disappeared into the early morning silence. What began as a targeted hit had spiraled into a double homicide, and no one yet knew they were gone. Marlin Cross drove for nearly 25 minutes from Delphine's home in Chattanooga to the East Side property where Loretta Ward lived alone. It was past 3 a.m. when he arrived. The street was quiet, tucked behind a row of older brick houses. Loretta's home, like many on the block, had no exterior cameras and backed into a line of dense trees. It wasn't fenced. According to Marlin's later confession, Loretta was already awake when he pulled into the driveway. She opened the side door and waved him in without saying a word. He reversed the SUV into the yard with its rear facing the back porch, where the women's bodies lay hidden beneath a tarp. There was no discussion about what had happened inside Delphine's home. Loretta didn't ask about Celeste or how things went. Her only instruction, as he would recall, was to take care of it before sunrise. Marlin used a shallow utility shovel to dig a single wide pit along the rear property line. The ground was dry and firm, but not rocky. He placed both bodies inside, Delphine first, then Celeste. No caskets. No markings. No prayers. Just two lives lowered into the earth in silence. He covered the grave with soil, leaves, and pieces of broken fencing Loretta had been storing behind her shed. They worked quickly and quietly. There was no ceremony. No reaction. No hesitation from Loretta. The job was finished before daylight. Marlin rinsed his hands using a hose beside the porch and changed into a spare shirt she provided. They burned the original garments behind the shed. By the time the sun broke over the neighborhood, the SUV was gone, the grave was masked, and no one passing by would have suspected what had been buried just feet away. Marlin left the house before 6 a.m., driving Delphine's SUV a few miles before abandoning it in a parking lot near a closed-down flea market. He wiped the handles and steering wheel clean and walked away. The vehicle would not be found for several more days. By the end of the day, Delphine and Celeste were listed as missing. And Marlin Cross was already beginning to wonder whether he had just buried two people, for a woman who didn't plan to pay him in full. In the days following the disappearance of Delphine Ward and her daughter Celeste Ward-Banks, Chattanooga police launched a missing persons investigation that quickly expanded in scope, but offered little in return. Tyrone Banks, who had first reported his wife and mother-in-law missing, remained in constant contact with detectives. He provided phone records, text messages, and access to Celeste's social media accounts. Delphine's phone, however, had been inactive since the night of November 15th, and no outgoing activity had been recorded on any accounts tied to her bank or benefits. Friends and extended family were interviewed. Most described Delphine as cautious, especially in recent years. A few admitted they were surprised to hear she had let someone move in with her, especially someone much younger. Celeste had reportedly voiced quiet concerns to her father-in-law and a coworker just weeks earlier, saying she didn't fully trust the man living with her mother, but she hadn't gone into detail. Those statements gave investigators their first real lead, the man whose name no one knew. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking for any recollection of Delphine's last movements. One neighbor, a retired city worker, stated he had seen a vehicle backing out of Delphine's garage around 3 a.m. on the night she vanished. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, just assumed it was Celeste or a visitor leaving late. The vehicle matched the description of Delphine's SUV, which was no longer in the driveway. Another neighbor recalled seeing a man around the property regularly, someone in his 20s who seemed quiet and often avoided eye contact. Despite these observations, no one could provide a name or license plate. and the one home with an exterior camera facing the street had footage that auto-deleted every 48 hours. By the time police requested access, the night in question was already gone. Without a name, they couldn't pull credit card activity, social media, or employment records. Delphine had never formally added him to her lease or reported him as a tenant. No driver's license scans were on file with the apartment office. He didn't appear in her phone contacts or email. He left no paper trail. The missing vehicle was recovered 6 days later in an abandoned lot near a strip of defunct businesses. It had been wiped clean of fingerprints, and the back seat had been scrubbed with bleach. Forensic testing came back inconclusive. With no bodies, no suspect, and no forensic match, the case lost momentum. Flyers were posted. A press release was issued. Tyrone gave a short, emotional statement urging the public to come forward with any information, but tips dried up quickly. Weeks passed. The months. The lead investigator was reassigned. The case, though still technically open, had gone quiet. But then, on a Wednesday morning in late March 2015, a plain manila envelope was dropped at the front desk of the Chattanooga Police Department. It was addressed to missing persons. There was no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter that would break the case wide open. The letter claimed that Delphine Ward and her daughter Celeste Ward Banks were both dead, and that their bodies had been buried in the backyard of Loretta Ward, Delphine's mother-in-law. The writer gave specific details: how Delphine had been killed in the living room, how Celeste had come downstairs unexpectedly, and how the bodies were wrapped before being driven away. The letter named no killer, but referred to the job as a favor done for the woman who couldn't let go. It ended with one line: "Check behind the shed." Investigators immediately reopened the case. The specificity of the letter, including the mention of the garage, the approximate time of the murder, and the reference to bleach, matched details that had never been released to the public. The mention of Loretta Ward's backyard prompted immediate surveillance of the property while officers worked with the district attorney to secure a search warrant. By the following morning, a forensic team was dispatched to Loretta's home. A ground-penetrating radar sweep of the backyard showed soil disturbances consistent with shallow burials. Cadaver dogs hit within minutes. Investigators began to dig near the shed just after noon. By sunset, 2 human bodies were recovered, both wrapped in deteriorating fabric, each in a separate but closely placed section of the yard. Dental records and personal items confirmed the remains were Delphine and Celeste. Loretta was inside the house at the time of the dig. She made no attempt to flee and initially denied knowledge of the burial. But after being read her rights, she declined to speak further. She was taken into custody on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. Police now had the motive, the location, and the connection, but not the man who had carried it out. Investigators began referring to him as John Doe, pending identification. They combed through Delphine's online accounts, eventually recovering fragments of Facebook messages linked to a profile under the name J. Cross. That account had since been deactivated. No matching ID or traceable identity was found under that name. Photos were generic. Email traces led to an IP address tied to a public library terminal. The man had wiped his digital trail. A manhunt began for the unknown individual believed to have murdered both women. Tips were circulated through local and interstate law enforcement. A facial composite was created based on neighbor descriptions and shared with departments in nearby counties. For the first time in 4 months, the case had a direction, and a name finally surfaced at the top of the suspect board: Marlon Cross. 6 weeks after the recovery of Delphine and Celeste's bodies, a tip came in from a probation officer in Lexington, Kentucky. A man using the alias Corey Daniels had recently been flagged during a routine check for inconsistencies in his identification paperwork. He claimed to have relocated from Tennessee and had no state-issued ID, only a temporary work card and a rental receipt for a shared apartment. What caught the officer's attention was the man's reluctance to allow a photo to be taken. When the tip reached Chattanooga investigators, they requested surveillance and fingerprinting. Within 72 hours, the man known as Corey Daniels was confirmed through latent print analysis to be Marlon Cross, the same man now wanted in connection to the double homicide of Delphine Ward and Celeste Wardbanks. Local authorities executed a quiet arrest without incident. Cross was transported back to Chattanooga under armed escort. By the time he arrived, investigators had compiled enough evidence, through phone metadata, deleted messages, and the recovery of an old bus ticket, to tie him to both the Facebook alias J. Cross and the timeline of the murders. What investigators hadn't known until that point was Marlon Cross's deeper criminal history. In 2010, he had been arrested under a different name for aggravated assault involving a member of Loretta Ward's congregation. The victim, an older man, had refused to press charges after church leadership allegedly intervened. The records had been partially sealed due to a clerical error, and Cross had disappeared from the system for several years. It now appeared that Loretta had prior knowledge of who he was, and had chosen him deliberately. During formal interrogation, Marlon offered a partial confession. He admitted to killing Delphine and Celeste, but maintained that only Delphine was the intended target. Celeste, he claimed, had walked in at the wrong time. When asked why he decided to confess via the letter, he stated bluntly, "Because she didn't pay me what she promised. I did what she asked, and she tried to stiff me like I was some nobody." Investigators pressed for further details, but Marlon refused to elaborate on the logistics of the burial or his prior relationship with Loretta. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, fraud, and evasion of justice. Bail was denied. When investigators returned to Loretta Ward for further questioning, she remained composed but uncooperative. She refused to confirm any relationship with Marlon or acknowledge his confession. Presented with evidence that the bodies were buried on her property, she claimed ignorance. When told that Marlon had directly implicated her and mentioned the financial arrangement, she declined to respond. Despite the mounting evidence, Loretta displayed no remorse. According to officers present in the room, her demeanor was flat. She made no request for legal counsel during the initial session and remained silent for the rest of the interview. Investigators noted that her refusal to speak was not driven by fear, but by something else entirely, a complete lack of regret. When Loretta Ward finally broke her silence, it wasn't in an interrogation room or through a written statement. It was in open court. During a preliminary hearing held in the Hamilton County Criminal Court in July 2015, Loretta appeared before a judge for the first time since her arrest. The courtroom was filled with members of the public, local media, and former members of her congregation. Among them sat Tyrone Banks and several of Delphine's close friends. The expectation was that Loretta's defense team would request a continuance or move to suppress Marlon Cross's confession. Instead, what followed stunned everyone in attendance. When the judge asked if she had anything to say regarding the charges, Loretta stood and addressed the courtroom directly. There was no emotion in her voice. She didn't deny the burial. She didn't refute her relationship with Marlon. In fact, she leaned into it. "She had it coming," she said of Delphine. "She lived free while my son rotted in the ground. She smiled. She collected his money. She even took in a new man like nothing ever happened. If I had the chance, I'd do it again. Exactly the same way." The courtroom fell silent. A murmur spread through the gallery as the judge called for order. When asked by the prosecution if she understood the consequences of what she was admitting, Loretta responded, "I understand more than you think. That woman killed my son in every way but with her own hands. She left him vulnerable. She bled him dry. That wasn't a wife. That was a curse. When pressed about Celeste's death, Loretta showed no shift in tone. Collateral damage, she said. Unfortunate. But she chose her mother's side. That came with a price. Her public statement immediately negated any possible defense strategy. The judge ordered a full psychiatric evaluation, but experts later confirmed Loretta was mentally competent and understood her actions. In the days that followed, word of her courtroom confessions spread quickly. Attendance at her storefront church dropped to 0. The building was vandalized twice, once with spray paint and once with shattered windows. By the end of the week, the landlord issued a lease termination notice. The church was officially closed within a month. Loretta Ward remained in custody, held without bond. Her sentencing hearing was formally scheduled for the following month, where the court would determine her punishment, not just for conspiracy and obstruction, but for the chilling indifference she displayed in front of an entire room of grieving witnesses. As the murder case against Loretta Ward and Marlon Cross progressed, the Chattanooga Police Department quietly reopened the 2006 homicide file of Maurice Ward. The renewed interest was driven less by new forensic leads and more by the sheer weight of Loretta's courtroom confession. Detectives hoped that clarifying Morris's death might close the final loop in a tragedy that had already claimed 3 lives. The original case file had always been thin. Maurice had been shot once in a downtown parking lot just after midnight. No suspects had been named. His wallet and personal belongings were still on him. No security footage captured the moment. At the time, detectives assumed it was a robbery gone wrong, though many quietly admitted it didn't fully fit the profile. With renewed investigation came a call for public assistance. Local media recirculated the cold case. Within 3 weeks, a woman walked into a precinct office in Augusta, Georgia. Her name was Gwendolyn Price, and she said she could no longer live with what she knew. According to her statement, she and Maurice had carried on a months-long affair in 2005. At the time, Maurice had been working occasional shifts in Augusta for a private security contract. Gwendolyn's husband, Russell Price, suspected the infidelity but never confronted her directly. Instead, she now claimed, he had quietly arranged for Maurice to be killed after catching the two of them leaving a motel together. She said her husband made the call less than 48 hours after confirming the affair. Maurice was killed the following week. Gwendolyn stated that Russell never spoke about it again. He died in 2013 after a short illness. On his deathbed, he confessed to the murder for hire in vague terms, referring to it as settling the score. Gwendolyn claimed that after learning about what had happened to Delphine and Celeste, she couldn't stay silent any longer. The details she provided matched key elements of the case that had never been made public: the time Maurice left work, the color of the car he had driven that week, and the fact that he had parked on the far side of the lot due to construction near his usual exit. Gwendolyn's statement shifted the entire context of the Ward family tragedy. Morris's murder had not been connected to insurance, or Delphine, or any financial motive. It had been a crime of jealousy, carried out by a third party for reasons Delphine never even knew existed. After verifying parts of Gwendolyn's timeline and cross-referencing names and phone records, investigators confirmed that Delphine had never been under suspicion for a reason. There had never been anything to tie her to the crime, because she wasn't involved. What Loretta Ward had believed for nearly a decade, what had fueled her obsession, her hatred, and ultimately her role in a double murder, had been entirely false. Delphine Ward was innocent. From the beginning. In September 2015, sentencing hearings were held for both Loretta Ward and Marlon Cross at the Hamilton County Criminal Court. Marlon, having already confessed and entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of first-degree murder, received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His demeanor remained unchanged throughout the proceedings, flat, detached, and unaffected by impact statements from family members. When given the chance to speak, he declined. Loretta's sentencing drew greater public attention. After a psychological evaluation ruled her competent to stand trial, and with her own courtroom statements on record, the jury took less than a day to deliberate. She was convicted on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. The judge, citing her complete lack of remorse, handed down a sentence of life in prison without parole. Tyrone Banks, now a single father, was granted full custody of his and Celeste's daughter. Court records show that he declined all media requests, choosing instead to focus on raising his child away from the public eye. He was present at every hearing and attended both funerals. According to family friends, he never spoke Loretta's name again after the sentencing. Delphine and Celeste were laid to rest in a joint ceremony held at a modest Baptist church where Delphine had occasionally volunteered. Their coffins were placed side by side, surrounded by white floral arrangements and military flags honoring Delphine's service. The crowd was small but deeply affected. Veterans, co-workers, neighbors, and family members all gathered to remember two women who had disappeared in silence and were mourned with heavy, unresolved grief. Community members later reflected on how the case had exposed the quiet destructiveness of long-held resentment. Loretta's refusal to question her assumptions, even in the face of years of silence, had led to actions that could never be undone. She had clung to a lie until it became truth in her mind, and by the time reality emerged, the damage was irreversible. As one investigator stated during closing arguments, this wasn't just about revenge. It was about pride, control, and a failure to ask the most important question before burying the people you hate. The case closed with a quiet, haunting irony, one that echoed even after the final gavel dropped. She buried them with her hands, and never once asked if they were guilty.